Thank you. Great. Good morning, Jan. Again, hope you're well. Before we're going to be talking about sharing your story, and I'm not sure if you identified that as the topic for today, but before we move on, can you give me a sense of what do you at this point in your development in your I'm assuming you're developing the art of coaching recovery or being a peer support person, and correct me if I'm wrong, but at this point in your development of your own art, what do you most need to learn relative to telling your story? Is it something that you've had experience with? Is it something that you feel challenged by, stressed by, or feel comfortable with? The bottom line question is, what do you feel would be helpful for you to learn in talking about sharing your story or in the process of sharing your story? Can you respond to that for me, Jan? Thank you, Stacy. Sharing your story effectively in peer support relationships. That's what we're going to focus on today. I really had a lot of fun pulling this together because it really reminded me. Yeah, I was wondering too, Stacey, because things weren't working for me on this end. Thank you. I really enjoyed pulling this piece together because we all have a story to tell, whether in recovery or not. And clearly, when we're talking about peer support relationships, it's an effective piece of the work that we do. So I think it's a critical part of my developing my art of helping recovery as a peer helper. So sharing your story effectively in peer support relationships. Over the next hour, we're going to be able to identify the value of self-disclosure in providing peer support. We're also going to make an effort to distinguish between stories of addiction and illness versus stories of recovery. And there is a difference, and we want to identify the pros and the cons and the benefits and the liabilities of that prospect. We're going to describe components of effective recovery story sharing, and we're going to be able to identify assets and liability of sharing an addiction / illness or recovery story. When I talk about addiction or illness, it's really an opportunity and an effort to expand this whole concept that I'm getting a better grasp of peer support specialists who work more in the field of mental health. But clearly in my own work in recovery, it borders both prospects. So when you think about this next hour, it's about appreciating that hope is real, help is real, and your story is important. And again, we all have a story. And clearly, Jan, that's why we're doing this work, so that we can utilize our story to the best benefit to the people we're making an effort to help. Are you with me, Jan? Can you hear me, Jan? Welcome, Beth. We're just getting started. If you notice, there's the agenda for today. It's looking at self-disclosure and providing support for peers. It's distinguishing between stories of addiction, illness, and recovery. It's describing components of effective recovery story sharing, and it's identifying the assets and liabilities of sharing either an addiction / illness or recovery story, an appreciation of the differences in these two concepts. And one of the questions that comes up front is, as we move through this webinar, is for you to think about, what do I most need to learn relative to my experience in telling my story as a part of recovery coaching? How you doing today, Beth? Excellent. You're typing. I was questioning whether or not my microphone was working. Good to hear from you. Good. No problem being late. We're just getting started. And as you see, I think the change in the date may have had an experience of not having as many people, but please take advantage of this intimate opportunity to work through this information. And again, as we get started, are any thoughts that you have about what might you most need to learn in relation to your own experience and sharing your story in peer support relationships? Anything you can think of that you'd most need to learn or feel is a strength for you in this aspect? You need to remember you're human. And remembering you're human is an effort to remember what aspects of your humanity are critical in this process. I am not perfect. It can only take someone as far as I've been. I am and should be a work in progress. Life is a journey of growth and change. Well stated, and clearly I agree with all of what you said. Um, as much as it's about the recovery and it's not about me, but it's also about me and my ability to live, learn, and lead a pathway of recovery so that I can have some value in helping a recovery along their own pathway. Well stated. I like that. I'm hoping that this webinar adds to your own personal growth and change process and helps you. And I think it has some elements as we move along that really help you to explore and be aware of that journey and change process so that you can best articulate it, share it, disclose it as a part of sharing your story. So I think we're right on the line. I'm fairly talented. Excellent, excellent, excellent. That's what it's about, sharing a message of hope. I liked this image when I saw it. What do you think, Beth? Stories can conquer fear, and they can make the heart bigger. Oh, Hope Hustler. I like that. Good morning, Virginia. Welcome. We're just getting started. I like the concept of Hope Hustler. I like the concept of being a provider of hope. And the hustle piece for me really demonstrates the active, intentional effort to offer hope, if I'm correct. Stories can conquer fear, They can make the heart bigger. I think that applies. What do you think? What do you see in that image? What do you hear in that image? How do you experience that image? What do you think about that image? Beauty in the journey. Oh gosh, well stated. I like that. I didn't capture that at all, but that is the beauty in the journey. The ability to share who I am It's amazing. So much of my own process in conquering the fear was the willingness to let people know who I am. I read a book years ago by a Jesuit priest who said, the title of it is, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? And the fear was that you would not like me as much as I didn't like me at that point in my life. So the ability to tell our stories, our ability to become vulnerable and share ourselves for the purpose of helping another human being experience hope and possibly direction. Sharing your story effectively in peer support relationships. Let's get started. Again, input would be helpful and valuable, and clearly your ability to think about these concepts will, I think, add to your ability to develop your own art and experience this to its capacity. What have you learned about yourself in your own recovery process that can inspire others working on their recovery if you share that information? And how do you communicate your recovery story to others? Do you have a clear sense of those two concepts? Any thoughts about that? What have you learned about yourself in your own recovery process that can inspire others? It's about inspiration. It's about hustling hope. It's about providing hope. It's about, in the spirit is to inspire. And how do you communicate your recovery story to others is clearly how we're getting started and want to begin to think about this concept. I always believe that we live, we learn, we live, and we lead. And part of the leadership, as I experience, is sharing my story, leading people along a path that has worked for me. So much of this is an effort to think about, what's my story? What have I learned about me? And how can I effectively communicate that to another human being in a humble effort to lend power to that person's efforts to change? I just liked this image. It speaks to peer support. It expands the possibilities. It looks at what so much of this work is about. Embrace the image. Image in, as I say. And just take a look at it for a couple of minutes and any impressions that come through for you. But we're talking about sharing our stories in our humble effort to support peers in a recovery process. And look at all that has the ability to attain and be a part of this process. Empowerment, resiliency, support, empathy. I mean, all the things that we talk about and think about, especially as we move through our own journey, but also the Recovery Coach Academy. A lot of this information is a part of the process. And on the side there, the collaboration is the critical piece to me. Sharing our story is a collaborative effort to connect with another human being to help them to see that hope and change is possible. And this is all a part of that experience as I see this image. Sharing lived experience is a valuable peer recovery support tool. A major recovery tool that we as peer recovery support helpers bring to recovery services is sharing our own story. The recovery story is a powerful tool because of its own personal story. It is your own personal story that is shared the way it happened. In peer recovery support, help and recoveries can be inspired by hearing the truth, hope, and possibilities in your recovery story. Road to recovery in your own words. Again, I think this webinar, I hope, offers an opportunity to frame that story, to think about that story, to experience the parts of my story so that I can effectively and appropriately offer my story. Thoughts or comments so far, folks? It'd be helpful if this is interactive. I want to know what you're thinking. More importantly, it's helpful that you give me a sense of what you need and what's helpful for you or not. Any thoughts or comments? Beth, I've had you typing for a while. Is your typing stuck? Well, hopefully you'll come through. Let me move along. Again, folks, please, 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 this is a very intimate group. Get what you need. Help me help you. Think about the value of self-disclosure in our peer recovery support relationships. When used appropriately, self-disclosure creates an environment of mutuality in peer support relationships, fosters trust between the recovery support coach and the recoveree. And again, there goes that word again. It instills hope that change is possible and that life can get better. How would you describe an environment of mutuality? And how do you perceive, or how do you help create that? Looks like we lost Beth, or maybe she had to reboot because I'm not sure if her typing was working. So it's me and you, Virginia, at this point. And hopefully this helps. Beth's back. Virginia's typing. Please, folks, help this to be as interactive as possible. I want to know what you know. I want to know what you need. Technical difficulties. Better, Beth? When I think of mutuality, I think of an equal playing field. Yeah, Virginia. 4 laws of change speaks to the environment of mutuality as I think about it. The 4 laws of change are that change must come from within. It must be preceded by a great vision. It must take the great learning must occur. However, the piece about environment of mutuality, the 4th law of change is that we must create a healing forest. For me, an environment of mutuality is a major component of creating a healing forest. What do you believe are the components of your ability to create an environment of mutuality, whether it be in a one-to-one, whether it be working with families, or whether it be in leading or being a part of a recovery community center, which you have a major responsibility at this point of doing, Virginia. How do you see, what are the elements, what do you see as our ability to create an environment of mutuality? I like that it's an equal playing field. What else does an environment of mutuality speak to? Because that's a critical part of what I think appropriate self-disclosure helps to bring to the fore. Mutual trust, respect, honesty, yes. Genuineness is huge. Yes. Feed me, folks, feed me. Mutual trust, respect, honesty, genuineness. Yes, yes, yes. It's so much, when I think about that environment of mutuality and peer support relationships, it is so much about our ability to have an attitude that treats people as resources versus recipients of services or objects of services that we think they need. Mutuality in an environment, so much for me is the ability to develop competent cultures that receive everyone. And that's a critical part of this process where whether I'm sitting across from someone one-to-one in a family session or providing an environment of safety and protection and an oasis to help recovery. Thank you, folks. Well done. Think about the art of self-disclosure. Knowing what, when, and with whom to share. Stop 1. Assess the level of intimacy between you and the other person. Do I take a risk? Am I willing to share? Do I feel comfortable in sharing who I am with another human being? If there's a discomfort, then there's something going on in that relationship that might not be comfortable for the recovery as well. Step 2, what is the risk level associated with the what, where, and who of telling my story? And step 3, why do you want to reveal the information as a part of the disclosure? That's a critical part, and we'll talk more about that. But knowing the what, when, and with whom to share is something that's critical to think about. Let's explore an interesting concept that I came across as I was looking to research this particular webinar. And it talked about you can have an addiction, illness, versus a recovery story. And I expanded addiction slash illness because we also want to embrace co-occurring disorders. We also want to embrace peer specialist trainings that are going on and peer specialist activities that are going on where people with shared experience in mental health recovery are sharing their selves as well. So when you look at addiction and all that entails and that upper image, and then there's that cute t-shirt that says, this is what recovery looks like. And you have an opportunity to demonstrate either one of those situations. Let's move forward and look at the addiction, illness slashes recovery story. The focus of an addiction or illness story, it focuses on the effects and the impact of the addiction or the illness. It features the powerlessness and limiting or disabling effect of the addiction or illness. It limits the conversation to the sharing of war stories related to the illness or addiction, and it promotes the reliving of troubled or difficult time. Also, that focus supports thinking of life as limited and lends to a sense of helplessness, the belief that this is the way life will always be. And I like this little piece on addiction. I can choose to let it define me, confine me, refine me, outshine me, or I can choose to move on and leave it behind me. Part of telling my story is helping people to see that I can leave it behind me. Any thoughts about this focus? Have you thought about, this particular focus relative to addiction and illness story? Does this make sense to you? Can you add to these bullets relative to how does a focus on addiction slash illness story in our work with recoverees impact that work as we focus on addiction or illness in the work? And do these bullets make sense to you? And what would you add to this list? When we focus on an addiction illness story, how might that impact the relationship that I'm having or the conversation that I'm having with the recovery? Let's really tease this out, folks. I think your input is equally as valuable as what these bullets present and what the research has offered me. And the other piece of that is if you are in recovery yourself, can you relate to the fact that, perhaps in our early efforts to help, there might have been more of a focus on my addiction slash illness story than my recovery story? I know that's been my experience, but it'd be interesting to hear what yours has been. And also interesting to hear how that may have transitioned to what you might do today, which I would imagine is more of a recovery-focused story, which we'll look at. How does a focus on my addiction or illness story impact the relationship? Given these bullets as well as beyond these bullets. I've got both Virginia and Beth typing, and I'm anticipating. It may make the recovery wary of your ability to help them. How can he or she help me? They're more screwed up than I am. Yeah. It's interesting, Beth, because I can remember when we first started doing this work, and so many times people in recovery would go into schools and talk to students. And we began to see that much of what the students were learning was that I can be an addict for a while and then I can change. And that's a tough, that's a part of the story. Virginia said, I've heard these types of stories over and over again within 12 shows that I would agree with you. They can limit the conversation to a sharing of only the war stories. Yeah, because it almost gets to the point sometimes, Virginia, that people want to one-up each other and tell a story that's more fantastic or more intense than other people's stories. And there's a value to sharing my truth. But how do we share our truth and still move forward and not get bogged down in the abyss from which we're trying to escape. That's a very powerful point, the war stories that occur. And again, it's an easier story to listen to than a story of hope and care and empowerment that we're making a humble effort to share with recoverees. Beth is typing. You may have already thought about these four. That's okay, Beth. Take care of it. Take care of yourself. We'll move along slowly. Want your participation. Think about the risks and benefits of sharing an addiction/illness story. The benefits for sharing an illness or addiction story, it promotes a connectedness that shows you have been there. It shows an understanding of what another person is going through and has the ability to promote empathy. An addiction illness story risks are it may keep the person stuck in thinking of him or her himself as being sick. And the person hearing the addiction illness story may believe the addiction illness story is not as bad as his or her own story, or vice versa. Again, comparing versus identifying can be a risky process here. Yeah, the benefits do seem to be more for the individual sharing. And isn't that what we're looking for? Not. It promotes it. Think about, I like your comment, Beth, because the benefits are more for the individual sharing. It promotes a connectedness. It gives a person an identification that I get a sense of what they're going through, and it's a humble effort to promote empathy. And yet that's where I was stuck early on in my efforts to help. Without the skills of communication, active listening, asking good questions, I found myself as an effort to make a connection, as an effort to demonstrate, an identification in their process and with themselves. I told more of my story. My story became my counseling technique in many ways. Yeah, it's more about my sharing. It's ineffective. Yeah. What were the blocks to figuring it out for you, Beth? Because for me, it became so comfortable early on because it was a way of relating. And again, early in my own process of helping and in that process recovering, I still struggled with relationships. I think that's why it's so potent that we talk so much about relationships, because it's a critical piece of what I've had to learn over time in order to be effective in another person's life, and my own included. So here I was desperately trying to demonstrate to a person I cared and wanted to help. But I think much of, like you say, Beth, those benefits of telling that addiction story were more for me. I found other ways to relate. I'm particularly effective at engaging people. It's my sixth sense. So you've taken what for many of us ACOAs can be a weakness and developed it into a strength. You've taken what could be a threat to the relationship building into a real opportunity for relationship building by finding a way to effectively and most importantly efficiently telling your story. What makes either one of you effective in engaging people? What do you see your strengths that you bring to relationships that demonstrates your ability to engage people? Because that's a critical concept. I'm aware of my ability to read people and engage them is interconnect with my own stuff, particularly my ability to be able to read a person almost immediately and adjusting my approach accordingly. How does that work for you? And does it work for you? Because whenever I see my stuff in the midst of stuff, I think through that stuff. That's funny. So much of my telling my story is predicated upon my ability to actively listen, to ask good questions related to what I'm hearing, and the ability to manage and discover my own stuff in the midst of that impacts my use of my story. I think that'll get teased out a little bit more as we move on and look at, telling your story. My stuff isn't in the midst, just help me hone my abilities, a tactic that kept me safe in my own past, and it's become an ability to help other people. Nicely stated. Nicely stated. Am I hearing that self-awareness in the midst of helping others is another critical aspect of effective helping? And it's interesting that you find and are looking for safety. My stuff is in the midst of and help me home. A tactic that has become help self-awareness is the best tool we have. Yeah, it goes back to day one, module one, Recovery Coach Academy. Who am I? That is so critical to this ongoing process of developing your art of helping. Who am I in the midst of all this and making sure I don't lose myself, especially in telling my story? Any other thoughts about the benefits, the risks and benefits of sharing an addiction illness story before we move on to looking at sharing a recovery story? And folks, I'm prodding you for your information because for me it is so helpful to learn what you know and to hear what you know because it helps me to know what I know and do what I do. I think we lost Beth again to her technical difficulties. She'll be back soon, hopefully. And we'll spend some time on the next slide. When we focus on a recovery story, it focuses on change as being possible. One of the first questions I ask a recovery when I first meet with them are twofold. Is change possible for you? And are you worth changing? And those come from William Glasser's work in reality therapy that I did way back in the 70s. And it's a critical question because I want people to focus on change, and many times that change focus is diminished or impacted by a sense of their own self of being flawed and defective. So are you worth changing becomes a critical question. But focus on a recovery story, focus on change as being possible. It highlights an individual's strengths. And recovery coaching, helping in this way is an empowerment, strength-based model. Remember that. We're focusing on recovery, wellness, care versus illness and addiction. Focus on recovery promotes health and well-being. It features overcoming obstacles and barriers. So while I may disclose the obstacles and barriers in my own process, it's also a demonstration of how those obstacles and barriers have been overcome, which I think is a valuable information for the recovery as well. It supports the sharing of what has worked for you in overcoming challenges and maintaining, sustaining recovery and wellness, and I'll add care. My journey from addiction to recovery, my journey from this desire or need to share my addiction slash illness story as a badge of honor to one of sharing my recovery story as an opportunity to help someone else along a path of their own process. What do you think about these bullets, and what would you add to these bullets relative to your own appreciation of what a focus on a recovery story brings to the relationship with a recovery? What does the focus of a recovery story bring to your relationship with the recovery. Anything beyond these bullets that you see. One of the things I also pay attention to and want you to pay attention to is that I'm constantly paying attention to the three-legged stool. So much of what I try to do, whether I'm doing webinars or I'm doing recovery coach performance support individual or in groups, is to model recovery coaching. So I enjoy asking good questions now. I enjoy actively listening to what people have to say and then asking good questions to be able to help people hear what I'm hearing, but also learning about that person as they're sharing who they are with me. It's treating people as resources, folks. They are the experts on their experience, and the ability to help them to help themselves is the ability to share pieces of me, and that's what my focus on my recovery story does. As with telling our illness or addiction story, there are risks and benefits of sharing a recovery story. The benefits of sharing a recovery story is that it supports recovery. It demonstrates to the recoveree that change is possible. It demonstrates recovery as a non-linear process. Excuse me for the lack of space. Remember what non-linear means. It's not, from straight line from point A to point B. There are hills and slopes and valleys and rumbles and all kinds of disconnections that goes on. But it demonstrates that it's a process that goes up and down and all around, and the importance of staying focused and committed to the process. It promotes and instills hope. Since we started this webinar, that word hope constantly comes up. So clearly the benefit of telling our recovery story is instilling and promoting hope. Other benefits that you see in sharing a recovery story, folks, before we get to the risks. Any other benefits that you have experienced or that you see in sharing a recovery story with a recovery? I hope so, Beth. I hope so. Recovery story risks may seem as if you're promoting that my way is the only way, might provide unfair expectations on the part of the recovery, setting the bar either too high or too low. It focuses on the peer recovery supporter and not the person being supported. And your own level of success may seem unattainable to someone in distress. Do these make sense for you, these recovery story risks? And how aware are you of these potential risks in telling your own story? Do they make sense? And what might you add to the to risks of telling your recovery story? The risk is that it focuses on the peer recovery supporter story and not the person being supported. That's a fine line, isn't it? It's a fine line, much like the fine line between helping and enabling. I have a responsibility to the recovery, but I can't have responsibility for them. So my ability to tell my story is the ability to just share what I feel is helpful for them to hear, but constantly remembering that it's about the recovery and it's not about me. Let's look at some of the components that your recovery story might entail. And think these through, folks, and continue to think about them, because I think they're also helpful in deepening, stabilizing our own process, because it gives us a sense of where we've been and where we are and where we're going, which are also always helpful. So when you think about the components of your recovery story, what are some of the early signs that you were beginning to have difficulties? Describe yourself in your situation when you were at your worst. What helped you move from where you were to where you are now? And how did you accomplish this change? What did you do? What did others do to help you? And what have you had to overcome to get where you are today? It's amazing when I found this piece it reminded me of pieces of my own process that entail these pieces. And I had never seen this piece before, but clearly looking at the early signs, looking at myself when I was at my worst. In fact, I have a document that identifies the holistic, I call it a holistic focus. And what I did was I looked at all the aspects of my life in the middle of my life. I think it was 1974 to 1984. And interestingly enough, that's when things began to change for me. So I have documented on a pretty powerful document that, when I did it, I was just trying to get a sense of where I was that applies to these questions. I think it's helpful for all of us to jot notes to ourselves relative to the components of our own recovery story so that it's clear for us. It demonstrates the components of it. So I think that best gives me a plan on how to share that story. Components of your recovery story. What have you learned about yourself and your recovery? What are some of the strengths you have developed and used in recovery? What types of supports have you developed and used? And it also speaks to recovery capital. And what are some of the things you do to sustain and maintain your pathway of recovery today? Can you see it, folks? I mean, let's go back. Look at these components of your recovery story as having wonderful possibilities in providing the ability to ask good questions in our conversations that matter with recovery coaches. There's a dual piece going on here. I want to know these elements for myself, but in asking these questions, because so many times when I do Recovery Coach Academy and even when I do Recovery Coach Performance Support, people may be challenged or struggle with the concept of asking good questions. I find that a lot of the asking of good questions comes from assessments. It comes from a desire to know. It comes from my active listening with care and concern and a willingness to know more and helping a person to deepen their understanding of themselves. So why not, as we think about telling our story, to be real clear of what our own story looks like as evidenced by what these questions that provide some insight and some awareness of the components of your recovery story. Again, I want to go into that relationship with the recovery, knowing who I am. And a big piece of knowing who I am is knowing my story and helping people to see that recovery is possible. Any thoughts or questions about the components of your recovery story? I'm hammering a point here, folks. I think these 2 pages have a breadth of opportunity to help you to really shape your own art of telling your recovery story effectively and efficiently. Effectively communicating your recovery story. Identify where the person is in their own recovery journey to guide what parts of your story to share. Give careful consideration to the part or parts of your recovery story that may be helpful to the person at this time in their recovery. Be aware. Are you involving the person in the conversation or are you talking at them? Key piece of treating people as resources, key piece of actively listening, involving people in the conversation. Use brief pieces of your story if applicable. And remember, the purpose of self-disclosure is to benefit the recovery. The focus must not be on you for long. Make sense? Helpful? Effectively communicating your story. After I've got an awareness of what my story is, how do I begin to effectively communicate it? And so much of that, when you look at these 5 bullets, it's about the recovery. It's not about me. Where my story becomes a part of their process, my story should not overwhelm or be too big a piece of their process. I tell people all the time when I first got started doing this work, I would think 90% of what came out of my mouth was self-disclosure. I think at this point 5, maybe 10% happens. And I think in many ways it has evolved in what this says, effectively communicating your own story. Any thoughts or questions there? We're moving towards the ending. I want to make sure that this is making sense for you. At some level, this has some value for you. And the value could also be, because I firmly believe that learning is finding out what you already know. Doing is demonstrating you know it, and teaching is reminding others that they know just as well as you do. Think about the opportunity to communicate to recoverees the same opportunity and being able to help them to frame for a framework in developing their own art of telling their story. I mean, you teach best what you most need to learn, and you learn something when you teach. You learn something twice when you teach it. So again, folks, when you look at this particular webinar, I think there's some powerful elements that can be shared with recoverees in a humble effort to help them to learn how to tell their story, whether it be in 12-step programs or otherwise. I hope so, Virginia. I really do, because this, it's helped me as well. And again, if it's offering you some clarification and some clarity, again, we're all learners, doers, and teachers. What you learn, do it, practice it, and then teach it to someone that it'll be helpful to. I mean, as a recovery coach, I coach and I coach and I coach and I coach, meaning that I coach recoverees who coach other recoverees. I mean, it's a real collaborative um, building self opportunity. And so if it's making sense and it offers clarification for you, find a way to help it to make sense for others and increase their clarification as well. But thank you, Virginia. Parting thoughts on sharing your recovery story. Is the recovery story you're relating in your past or from the past? Ideally, your recovery story includes what's going well in your current life as well. Are the details you are sharing relevant and related to the recovery you are helping? It's about the recovery. It's not about me. I tell my story in response to actively listening, thinking about questions that I might ask in relation to that. And sometimes versus asking the good questions, I share a piece of my story that are brief pieces of my story that are the brief pieces of your story you are sharing about your personal recovery, focus on tragedy or transformation. I like this one. The positive transformative experiences you have a key place in your recovery story, and I believe have a key place in helping others. So when you think about in telling your story, are you focused on the tragedy or the transformation? And I can sprinkle in the tragedy, but I want heavy doses of transformation to come through. It's the possibility of transformation that I believe brings the possibility of hope and change. On the cover of the Recovery Coach Manual, Participants Manual is transformed people transform people. Through sharing our story, it gives us a wonderful opportunity to offer transformative experiences that give the recoveree hope and the experience of possibilities beyond what they believed possible. Make sense? Any thoughts or questions on these parting thoughts on sharing your story? Again, as much as I share my past, I also want to share my present. I also want to share the process and the evolution of that process and helping a person to appreciate through their own awareness and experience of my process that they have a process that they can engage in as well. I've got Virginia typing. What's your question, Virginia? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And again, Virginia, great point to bring up. Picture your ability to synthesize the information relative to the difference between an addiction slash illness story, its risks and its benefits, and a recovery story, its risks and its benefits. Think about having a group conversation around those two issues and think about the ability to improve the performance of the group to tell and share their story. It begins to give, like you said earlier, some clarification relative to what's helpful and what's not helpful. Most importantly, within and for the individual. It's not about me treating them like an object and telling them what they should say and what they shouldn't say and telling their story. It's offering them enough information to appreciate what empowers them and what might disempower them, what lends to clarification and ability to change and what doesn't. So you just sparked a thought in my head. Sharing my story in a group setting. Think about the ability to enhance the power and the experience of a group when the group participants are doing a better job of effectively using their recovery stories in supporting each other. I think what you're talking about, Virginia, is that I learn what I learn. I do this information in my effort to help, and I teach someone else, and they teach each other, and it's an opportunity for transformation. It's an opportunity for stories to become blended and to build on each other. And I think it clearly offers an opportunity for people to come together. What do you think? I mean, you asked the question, Virginia. Can you see this as being applicable to sharing a story in a group setting? It might limit the war stories if we give people a clear sense of recovery coaching, and recovery is a empowerment, strength-based model, focuses on process and progress and recovery. And how do we talk more about recovery through telling our recovery stories and limiting the sharing of what has been addiction and illness stories? Great point. I'm going to build on that. In fact, some point maybe we'll have a webinar on sharing your story in a group setting. I think it makes sense. Think about it. Well, I think, what do you think the red flags are? I think the red flags are the risks and the benefit focus. I think you help the group to tease out the red flags. So much of this is I learn, I do, I teach. And part of my learning through my teaching is learning what I don't know. If I don't know what I don't know, it's hard for me to be a part of the process, anybody's process. So yeah, I think it helps in a group setting. And the red flags help the group to help me to hear what the red flags are. Or as I'm actively listening and asking good questions, the red flags will come up and we'll talk about them. I mean, so much of this is collaborative learning, and let's not lose sight of that. When we talk about sharing our story, it's another opportunity to collaborate with another human being in a trusting and hope-filled relationship. We are about building relationships. Well done. Okay. Last image. You are important and you matter. Your voice matters. Your life matters. Your feelings matter. Your story matters. Always. I loved this image. For me, it's a potent ending to this webinar. You are important and you matter. Your voice matters. Your life matters. Your feelings matter. Your story matters. Always. Again, Virginia, bringing up in a group context, share this image and have people talk about it. You'll get down to talking about the story. You'll get down to talking about, what matters for people. Thank you, Virginia. And thank you as well, Beth. I appreciate your participation. I appreciate your, coming together with us, once a month. I enjoy these webinars because, folks, I do walk away learning a lot from you as well. Anything else? Till next time, take care, folks.